One cannot talk about preserving without talking about preserving books. What books we could find, what recipes we could use, all of that. That's what we're going to be talking about today. All the list of books that you can use to learn these skills for preserving your food. Let's get growing. Hello and welcome to the Pray Just Plant podcast, the show that talks about growing a garden, a homestead, a healthy family, and most importantly, growing closer to God. I'm your host, Crystal Media, owner of the Red Ridge Farm Homestead, where our mission is to help women of faith find the courage to grow healthy food for their family while building a closer relationship with our Lord and Savior. That's you. Don't let the world hold you back. Pray, just plant. Welcome to the Pray Just Plant podcast. I'm your host, Crystal Media, and today we're going to be talking about books. Oh, it's my favorite topic. I'm an avid reader. If you didn't know that about me, you do now. But we're going to be talking about preserving books, not preserving the book, but books that talk about preserving, books that teach us how to preserve the food we are growing. We're going to talk about dehydrating books, fermenting books, canning books, meat books, books about preserving meat. We're going to talk about all those different books that you could get or get from your library and learn. The biggest part of preserving our food is the education of diving ourselves into something that may be new to you. Maybe you're used to buying canned salsa off of the grocery store, but you don't know anything about it for yourself. You can listen to the Pray Just Plant podcast, you can watch YouTube videos, but sometimes it's helpful to have a book. It's helpful to have something that you can go back to over and over and over again. And I don't know about you, but a book can hold so much more information than I think a video can. A video, yes, you can see the hands-on action of it, but just like comparing a book that you've read to a movie that's been made about it, the book has so much more. It can dive into a character more deeply. It can dive into a subject more deeply. And that's why I wanted to share these books that I have found. Some are on my shelves, some I dream were on my shelves. And I want to share them with you so that you can take that next step. You can take the next step of educating yourself on how to preserve your own food. So the first thing, I'm just going to go through each process we do for preserving, like dehydrating, fermenting, canning. And I'm going to list and describe and talk about a few books in each of those sections. I also have, just like a general section where we can get books that could help with multiple areas of preserving. I also have an extras book section where this is books about going beyond maybe preserving, but it's still about preserving, but it's bringing the whole circle together, or bringing all the pieces of the homestead together as well as preserving. So let's start with our first section of books, and we're going to talk about dehydration books. So the process of dehydration is when we take whatever we are choosing to preserve. You can dehydrate meat, you can dehydrate fruits and vegetables, you can dehydrate milk, you can dehydrate eggs, you can dehydrate so many different things. But it's when we remove using warmth or the sun, there's many different processes to dehydrating, and you're taking the moisture from whatever you're dehydrating, and that dries it out, and lack of moisture gives that vegetable or fruit a better chance of bacterias or something getting inside of it, because moisture is usually how bacterias travel. And so when we do that, it brings that product, like sliced bananas, to a shelf life that is a lot longer than a banana sitting on the shelf. No longer does the effects of decomposition, that's our point in preserving, right, is to slow the decomposition. Dehydrating slows that way down because we're taking the moisture away. So what are some really good books to purchase or to read about dehydration? So the first one that I wish was on my shelf would be, it's called The Complete Dehydrator Cookbook, How to Dehydrate Fruit, Vegetables, Meats, and More. This book is by Carol Kanzler, and It's just that. It's a complete dehydrating cookbook. Not only does it teach you how to dehydrate, not only does it walk you through the different steps of dehydration, like the different types of dehydration, it talks about the history of dehydration, how we go way back to sun-dried products in Egypt, to fish air-dried in Viking ships. She talks about a lot of the background behind dehydrating, but she also gets into the recipes. So she talks about how you can take like dehydrated bananas and make something from it. Her book is divided into about 3 different sections. One is A to Z drying. So she goes through everything you can think of from A to Z, 75 different kinds of foods, including fruits and vegetables, herbs, nuts, yogurt, tofu, meat, pasta, rice, all of those different things, and tells you how to dehydrate them. And then she has dehydrated dishes. She takes it even a step further and takes where you can actually make a recipe or combine different dehydrated foods and make what she calls just add water recipes. These just add water recipes are just that. You just add water to reconstitute the different dehydrated fruits and vegetables, whatever recipe you follow, and she walks you through making that recipe for your family using dehydrated foods. I find that very interesting because we focus a lot on dehydrating foods and then we're going to put it in something else. But I've never really thought about making my own RPGs, which is ready prepared meals, right? You just add water. And this book kind of walks you through that. She also talks about low temp dehydrating. This is really good for people that have a very high vegetable content for their meals so that they're wanting to get all the nutrients and fruits, all the nutrients you can out of those fruits and vegetables, because I've talked about this before in the canning process, in the cooking process, and in the dehydrating process also. When you use higher temperatures, some of those nutrients are diminished. Some of those nutrients aren't as potent as if you were actually eating that product raw. So she actually goes through how to do kind of what would help preserve some of those nutrients in those plant-based foods by doing low temperature dehydrating. And she walks you through those steps on how to do that. The next book is Dehydrating Food, A Beginner's Guide. This is wrote by Jay Bills. This is an easy guide that walks you through step-by-step directions, and it's more based on just the art of dehydrating food, but it takes you through the different methods as well. It takes you through sun drying, oven drying, net bag drying, and commercial food dehydrators. It kind of shows you how to use your dehydrator a little more efficiently. It too also goes into making meals, making different recipes out of the dehydrated foods that you have. Now, a lot of these recipes are not so much of just add water. They're more of the idea of you've dehydrated some bananas, now let's make banana bread, that kind of idea. So he does have lots of recipes. There's bread recipes, cake recipes, cereal and cookie recipes, dessert recipes, dressing recipes, fruit recipes, ice cream recipes, meat recipes, pie recipes, sauce and topping recipes. The recipes go on and on. Fruit flavored milkshake recipes, soup recipes, vegetable recipes. There's even one dish dinner recipes. So there's 164 different recipes to help you utilize some of that dehydrated food that this book teaches you how to dehydrate. It's mostly focused on the recipes. There is a lot of detail, though, on dehydration. It has a preparation chart for different fruits and vegetables. It gives you the exact steps for dehydrating fruit, how to test for dryness. It covers a lot of great details. And one of the favorite parts, and one of the reasons I want to get this book, is because of the making fruit leather. My kids have always loved fruit leather, and I have tried to make it for myself so many different times, but it's always been a fail. So that itself would be one reason that I would get this book. I think there's 164 other reasons. All those delicious recipes and stuff that are included in this book, this is definitely something I want to put on my shelf as well. I have a very long wish list. So usually every year when I buy school books, I throw in a few books for myself. This is another of my I wish I had it books. Because dehydrating is something that I would truly like to learn more about. I've dipped my toes in a little bit on it. I just this year dehydrated tomatoes. I'm hoping to do like a sun-dried tomato oil. Last year I think dehydrated peppers is all I did. And then a few years ago, I made jerky. I do make a lot of jerky and we're going to get to that. That's our next dehydrating book is jerky. I would love to learn how to make fruit leathers for sure, because the fruit leathers are really it's like when bananas are just that overripe or strawberries are just about to get overripe when they're not good for dehydrating themselves, but also not good for canning or freezing because they're just past their peak. I think fruit leathers would be a great way to do that. And I think soups too, like dehydrating different vegetables for soups would also be in that category. I think it would be so fun to learn more about dehydrating. And so the next book is the Jerky Bible, How to Dry, Cure, and Preserve Beef, Venison, Fish, and Fowl. We are going to talk about some more books about preserving meat, but I thought this one fit in the dehydrating section because it is all about jerky and dry curing and preserving some other things, but mostly about jerky. And that's what dehydrating meat usually is. You make jerky. So they talk about, what jerky is. They talk about the history of jerky. They even talk about jerky safety. I think that would be a very interesting chapter about how we could learn more about, the safety behind dehydration, the safety behind dehydrating meat. Also, jerky treats for your dogs. This book does look very interesting. It does look like it does have a lot of information in it, especially about the venison cooking. We are an avid family that does hunt, and so that's usually the types of jerkies that I make because there's something about turning venison into jerky. It just makes the flavors just a little bit better. But this book is wrote by Katie Fudaki. I hope I'm saying that right. Fiduccia Fudaki. I think this would be a great book. It has instructional step-by-step photos that take you through the process of making whatever different jerkies you want to do. They include Caribbean marinades, sweet beer marinades, and a bunch of different flavorful 40 flavorful marinades to create a range of flavors of different jerkies. I think that's one thing that I struggled with when I was making jerky. One, I'm new to dehydrating, so I would just buy a generic jerky mix that was supposed to be for venison or supposed to be for elk, and it would always turn out too salty, or it would turn out, artificial tasting. And so I think this book would be great to learn more about the different marinades that can help you, because marinades are focused on kind of breaking the meat down a little bit before you go into the dehydrating stage or even the cooking stage. Marinating meat is such a good process to help really break down the flavors, break down the fat molecules, and make it easier for you to digest as well. So the next section of books that I want to talk about is fermenting books. Only thing I have done is cabbage into sauerkraut. I did that last year. I took one cabbage that I bought at a farmer's market and I turned it into sauerkraut. And then I sat there and I waited and I waited and I waited. And I think I waited too long before I tried it because it was very sour. And after doing a little bit more reading, I found that you can actually consume it within a week, still get kind of a little bit more of the fresh taste and not as much of the sour taste, and still get the probiotic benefits. I think I waited 6 months before I tried it, and I'm not a sauerkraut eater to begin with. I've never ventured into that idea of sauerkraut. I don't know. I guess the name sauerkraut just has always turned me off, but I really wanted the probiotic benefits, so I thought the easiest way to start with fermenting is sauerkraut. So that's the only thing I've made. So these 3 books are also on my I want them list, and the first one is The Farmhouse Culture Guide to Fermenting, Crafting Living Cultured Foods and Drinks with 100 Recipes from Kimchi to Kombucha. I didn't know those were 2 different things. That's kind of cool. this is actually, it says it's an award-winning book. It is wrote by both Catherine Lucas and Shane Peterson. So it's a dual author book. Just two brains, right? Two brains bring more knowledge. So there is 100+ recipe. It says for krauts, pickles, kimchi, fermented vegetables, hot sauces. That is on our to-do list for this fall's preserving is fermented hot sauce. My middle son has gone through this stage of really liking hot sauce. I don't know if it's like a teenage thing or it's just a him thing, but he really likes hot sauce. And so I grew serrano peppers for the first time this year. I have heard that they are even hotter than jalapenos. My jalapenos sadly got eaten by, I think, a deer or maybe the goats when they got out. I have a bunch of serrano peppers. I've been dehydrating them, thinking I'll use them in salsa. But this idea of hot sauce, fermented hot sauce, just sounds so good. Fermentation is when you are using salt, begins to create its own alcohols or own cultures, and that's what preserves the food. And there's so many probiotics and so many good nutrients to fermented foods that I think to me it is worth learning about. And these are the 3 books that I chose that I want to learn from. So this one has 100 different recipes for preserving fruits and jams, kombucha, and even mead. I've always wanted to make honey mead. I don't know if I'd ever drink it, but I think it would be fun to make it. This is a fermented book that every home fermenter needs. You know, those words just scream to me, I need this book. And I will definitely share, if this is a book that I get, that I will share again with you if this book was worth all of its talk. So there's 12 different chapters. There's even chapters on carbonated and flavor fermented beverages. So I've heard about fermented sodas and carbonated fermented beverages. There's even sour tonics and water kefir. I would love to see if my kids could drink some of these. I think I would have to drink them first, but I think that would be great if I could replace some of the stuff my kids drink. I think that's like the hardest thing to get away from when you're trying to grow your own food is the drinks, because you can turn down, no, I'm not going to eat that candy bar because I can make something better like that at home. But when the kids enjoy soda, I mean, you can get the natural sugared ones, or you can get I've tried the ones that don't have much sugar on them. It would be nice if I could get the kids away from drinking soda. The next fermenting book is called The Art of Fermentation. This is a New York Times bestseller. It says it's technically the Bible for making your own sauerkraut, beer, yogurt, and pretty much everything involved microorganisms. That is a very cool quote. This book is, I hope I don't mess up this name either. It's wrote by Sandor Elix Katz, Elixkatz, and also the foreword by Michael Pollan. So you will find in this book detailed information on fermenting vegetables, sugars into alcohol, sour tonic beverages, milk, it's a different one, grains, starchy tubers, beer, beans, seeds, nuts, fish, meat, eggs, as well as growing mold cultures. Whew, this is a very extreme book using fermentation in agriculture and art and energy production and considerations for commercial enterprises. This book is a very thorough book. It's going to go into a lot of different areas of not only us as home preservers preserving our food through fermentation, but ideas on how we can even do it in our agriculture. That means like on the homestead. We have done fermented grains here at the homestead. It's very easy to do. You just wet your grain and store it for a little while, probably about a day and a half in a warm area, and it'll usually start to ferment. And what that does is it does the same thing for us, for our animals. It breaks down those grains, especially if it's an animal that's not used to eating grains or has trouble digesting grains. It breaks down that grain so it's more palatable as well as also easier to digest. And it also makes good probiotics that fuel the ruminant stomach. All ruminants have cultures in their guts that do a lot of the digesting. And so by fermenting the grains, we're promoting that. It's the same as the idea of doing probiotics. I use probiotics. That's my first go-to when my goats aren't feeling very well. I go straight to probiotics because the first thing an animal does when they're sick, it's usually something to do with the stomach. Usually it's that. But if it's something beyond that, probiotics are going to help. They're not going to hinder anything, but they're going to help if she does eat, or I'm saying she because I have mostly female goats. If they do eat, it's going to help them digest a little bit better. It's going to boost their stomach so that even if it's some other sickness, probiotics are going to help no matter what. I think this is great that there's a book out there that is talking about that idea, talking about not only fermenting and improving our own digestion, improving our food, taking the ideas of old times. Fermentation is a very old science. It's an art. Yes, it's a very old way of preserving food, and it's just amazing that this book is trying to bring it into the commercial enterprises, into areas where other people, even the energy production, can utilize it. Not just home growers, not just homesteaders, not just people who want to make a little batch of kombucha, but actually get it into the industry, because our food industry, I'm not going to get into it here, but it needs help. This book definitely does look like a textbook, a true textbook about fermentation. I think this would be a more advanced fermentation book. The next book would be Fermented Vegetables, Creative Recipes for Fermenting 64 Vegetables and Herbs in Krauts, kimchis, brine pickles, chutneys, relishes, and pasties. So this book, it says it's for beginners. And I love when books say that they're for beginners, because sometimes learning something new can be really daunting. I think if I would have picked up that last book, The Art of Fermenting, as my first book for trying to learn how to ferment, I would have been overwhelmed. And not anything against that book. I think that book is great for someone who wants to learn a little bit more. So if you are someone who already knows fermenting, I think that would still be a great book for you. But I like when books tell you it's not going to be too intimidating, that you can do this. And don't look at that you're a beginner at something as you're in kindergarten or you're really slow at something. That's not what they're trying to say. What they're trying to say is that I want to first, just like we should do in anything we learn, we need to learn the fundamentals. I started doing canning. I learned the easiest way of canning first. Water bathing. That is a fundamental, because in that you're going to learn all the procedures you need to do pressure canning. You're still going to blanch your stuff for pressure canning. You're still going to do other processes like make salsa or whatever. Learn how to make the recipes. Learn how to wash and take care of the jars. Learn how to recognize a chip jar. Learn how to recognize if a jar is sealed. All of those things are going to be beginner processes. So don't hesitate in buying a beginner book. I think it's very helpful because it will make you feel not so overwhelmed, because it's going to be a book that's going to walk you through everything step by step. It's going to be a book that is going to even dive in a little bit more in detail about those beginner steps. Like, why do you blanch? I know we're talking about fermenting, but why? I mean, that previous book, what we talked about dehydrating, it talked about the history of dehydration. It talked about the safety of in that jerky book, it talked about the safety of jerky. Those are things a beginner needs to know. They're not just something that's going to be, oh, mom said so. We are in a time of a lot of the things that these books are talking about that I'm sharing with you right now are knowledge that came from years ago. And somehow, even for myself, and maybe for you, somehow this knowledge was not shared with our parents. And sometimes this knowledge was not shared with our grandparents. It was our great-grandparents that did these things. And so we don't have that resource of let's go ask grandma how she did this. We have these books. And these people have taken the time to really dive into the subject and explain it to us. So even though you were a beginner, don't think any less than yourself. You are doing a hard thing right here. Fermenting or preserving your food is important, and it's a step of growing. It's a step of growing your homestead, growing a garden. It's just that step of bringing good, healthy food onto your family's plates, and you are going to grow. Every person, whenever we start learning something new, next year, you're going to know the beginner stuff, and you're going to be ready to move on to the back of the beginner book. And then the next year, you're going to be ready to move on to the Art of Fermenting book. It's okay to start at the beginning. You don't have to get into those big, huge books that will make you feel overwhelmed. So let's talk more about this book. I know I got a little bit off subject there, but Fermenting Vegetables book is going to be, it's by Christopher Shockey and Kristen K. Shockey. There's two writers here. And it is more about the reason I picked it out of the lineup of huge books is because it focuses on small batches so that you don't have to go out and buy crates and crates of something. It's something that you could do easily from your backyard garden. Even if you don't grow a lot of something, this concentrates on small batches. So you could only need like 4 or 5 things to make these recipes. And I think that is really helpful, especially right now for me personally. The garden is just barely starting to make a harvest. So I'm getting a few tomatoes here, and I'm getting a few green beans here, and a few this and a few of that. And that's where these small batches recipes come in. You can start preserving some of those small batches as small as 1 pint, so that those vegetables will still be preserved. They won't go to waste while they're waiting for more to be harvested. I think small batches are a great idea. So this book does 2 things for me personally. It's a beginner book and it does small batches, because another thing for my family is we don't eat a lot of fermented food. So I don't want to make 15 quarts of sauerkraut and then my family doesn't like it. What am I going to do with all that sauerkraut? I mean, the pig might eat it, but that was a lot of wasted time, work, energy for something my family doesn't like. Learn how to make a small batch of sauerkraut, and then my family likes it. Then I can figure out maybe there's more that my family would like, and I could try another small recipe and see if they like that. I think that idea of small batches is such a great way to get a family used to eating a different way of preserving food, especially fermentation or dehydration or any of these methods that we're going to talk about. If this is new to you and new to your family, sometimes it's going to take a different palate to like some of these things. So now it is time for the tips and tricks segment of this episode, where I share a few bonus tips and tricks I use here at Red Ridge Farm. This week's tip is brought to you by the How to Plan Beyond the Harvest Handbook. This handbook empowers growers to develop a garden plan for beyond the harvest, so they no longer have to deal with their harvest going to waste. The tip I want to share with you this week is weed control as you put your gardens to bed. Fall is coming, and the garden maybe, while you're listening, is in full swing right now, and you're getting prepared for your harvest. But fall is coming, and when we put our garden to bed, it's important to think about weeds coming up next spring, because they're going to. Here in Wyoming, in our Zone 4, it gets warm enough in March for the weeds to start to grow. I can't be out there in the garden yet, but the weeds are taking advantage, because weeds are usually plants that are accustomed to their environment. They're plants that can take over, and also plants that you just may not want to grow. So right now is when you need to be thinking about controlling weeds for next spring. There's many practices in a few blog posts that I have shared that talk about organic ways to control weeds. And one of those ways is solarization. What this does is you simply lay a tarp over your beds. I think this does 2 things for you. It protects your soil from the winter environment, that thawing and de-thawing that can really break down your soil, but it also protects the soil for next spring, because it's going to be covering it when the soil begins to warm up. The soil will warm up, the weeds will begin to grow, but because they don't have any sunlight, they will die back. And when you go to plant, all you'll have to do is pull back the tarp, clean up the dead weeds, and plant. Especially, I think this is a method that is great for no-till. I've told you a lot about how no-till really can benefit your soil. Another thing you can do, though, is a cover crop. You can easily be planting a fall cover crop that it could be a winter overcrop, so that you will have to till it up in the spring, but it's something you want to grow there. Remember, a weed is something you don't want to grow. So if you plant something you do want to grow that will come up in the spring and flourish and improve your soil, that's not a weed. That's a cover crop that you intended to put there. Those are just two things that you can use to control weeds now so that you can get into gardening a little quicker next spring with solarization and improve your soil for next spring with cover crops. So those are just two ideas. And I will put a link to those blog posts down in the show notes and description of this episode. So let's get back to the different category of books. So this category is canning books. Now, canning is something that there is so many books for, and I actually do have at least 2 of these books on my shelf, and I have gone through them, and I do truly enjoy them. One I would like to purchase because it is something that I think would be really good for a beginner. Remember, we talked about how even though you're a beginner, don't let that hold you back. This other book will be great for that. So let's get into these books. So the first book is The Ball Canning Back to Basics, a foolproof guide to canning jams, jellies, pickles, and more. This book is by Ball Home Canning Test Kitchen. So remember how I talked about beginning? I have this book, and what I love about this book is it gets into detail. It talks about the basics. I know when I was learning to play basketball, or even when my kids were learning to play baseball, the coach always said, go back to the basics. When you're having trouble with something, go back to the basics. Even an advanced person can learn so much by going back to the basics. So this book goes in depth. It gives very in-depth information on water bath canning, the equipment you need, and food safety guidelines. And it also goes through each preserving method thoroughly and explains with very, beginner-friendly tutorials and step-by-step photographs highlighting key steps. It also goes through ideas for low sugar preserving. I have not gone into that step of doing low sugar. I totally want to, though, after doing a lot more research about sugar and how it harms our bodies. That is something that I have wanted to go into, and so I went back to the basics for this. That's why I got this book, is because I really wanted to go back to the basics to learn about low sugar preserving. And the other thing I love about this book is their pictures. It's got a lot of pictures in it that explains. When I was way back learning how to can, I truly didn't understand the difference between marmalade and jam. Aren't they the same thing? Well, no, they're not. And so there's great pictures in here that show you, not just tell you, but show you the differences between marmalade, preserves, jams, the fruit, the jelly, all of that. So you can really get into detail. And there's pictures of the equipment with numbers next to it. So you can actually, okay, this is what it looks like. It's not just a list. This is what this thing looks like. When they're talking about the lid, they're talking about this. They're talking about the flat part. When they're talking about the ring, they're talking about the part that I tightened down on the jar, and actually shows a picture of it. And it also shares like basic gear beyond just the simple, like you need your water bath canner. Yes. But you also need other things, like you need a jar funnel. You're going to need ladles. Then they also have, like, you could get a headspace measuring tool. They talk about the lids, the jar lifter. You're going to need something to help you lift those jars out of that hot water. This goes into great detail. And it also talks about like the different sizes of jars and what they're mostly used from. Because when you go to the grocery store, they have different names on them, like jelly jars. Well, what does that mean? Is it just because it's a smaller jar? No, it means that it's a 4-ounce jar. There's jelly jars that are also 8-ounce jars. And it also tells you like what you would use in those jars. It also tells you if those jars are freezer safe, which is so cool because really anything beyond a pint and above aren't freezer safe because there's so much liquid there that when it expands, it'll break. But usually if you have smaller ones, the glass is just a little bit thicker and are a little bit easier to freeze, which is great. They talk about the regular mouth and the wide mouth. There's this full section on getting started with pictures on how to wipe off your jars. There's pictures on how to use the measuring head space measurer. It shows pictures on how to test the seal. There's tons of pictures, and there's even pictures on like testing like the spoon test with jelly or jams, how you turn that spoon sideways and it shows you the thickness that you're aiming for. This book is very detailed. It has lots of beautiful pictures in it, and even into the recipes when it gets in talking about the marmalades and the different individual recipes. It has great pictures that walk you through those steps. It even has like metric, and the only reason I'm like, telling you so much is because I have this book here. It's got metric equivalents in the back so that if you do find a recipe that you're using and it may be like from Canada, an author from Canada or an author from the UK, it helps you make those ml to measurements. Did you know that 3 teaspoons is 1 tablespoon? So instead of sitting there doing 1, 2, 3, you could just get a tablespoon out and do a bigger one. Or did you know that 2 tablespoons is actually 1/8 of a cup? Yeah, so it has those different conversions in it, which is really helpful when you're trying to make a lot of bulk things or double recipes. I've been teaching my kids how to do that, and I always go to this book to get those conversions for them. The next one is the all-new Ball Book of Canning and Preserving. This is another one that I have. There is another book that is like the Bible of Ball books, but that's not in this section. That's going to be in the preserving section because it does go into more things besides just canning. But this book is also the all-new Ball Book of Canning and Preserving, over 350 of the best canned, jams, pickled, and preserved recipes. So the previous book that I talked about goes through the basics, and it's more detailed about teaching you how to do the process and not so focused on the recipes. It does have recipes in it. It has a very few recipes in it, but it's more focused on the basics. But this book is more about giving you more recipes. Now you've learned how to make jam. Let's make tart lemon jelly, or let's make tomato herb jam. Let's go crazy and make some really good things. It also talks about pickling, fermenting, freezing, dehydrating, and smoking. It does have those things in it, but what I liked about it is it does have more detailed recipes for making more jellies and jams, more different kinds of pickles, more different kinds of salsas, just more extended recipes. The third book for the canning section is going to be the Full Proof Preserving. It is again about those small batches. It's a guide to small batch jam, jellies, pickles, condiments, and more. Now, I've told you, why small batches would be so important for your family, especially if you're learning something new. But it's also going to help utilize when you don't have a lot of produce yet coming in, or your farmer's market, you are late and you only got 1 or 2 packets of strawberries. And it has 100 foolproof recipes. And this is from the American Test Kitchen. I don't know if you've ever watched that show, American Test Kitchen, Country American Test Kitchen. They are recipes that these people at American Test Kitchen have actually made and tested to make it perfect for you as a beginner or you as someone who wants to make sure these recipes work. They've tested them and they are worthy. So now we're going to go into the section about, preserving general books that talk about preserving in general and also includes different ideas. I actually have 4 books in this area. The first book I'm going to bring up, and this is a book I want to get because like I told you, I want to work on low sugar. So Preserving with Pomona's Pectin, the revolutionary low sugar, high flavor method for crafting and canning jams, jellies, conserves, and more. So there's a method to less sugar. There's even special pectin to help you. And so this book is specifically made for using this specific pectin called Pomona's Pectin. Pomona's is sugar and preservative free. It's citrus pectin that does not require sugar to gel. What I love about this book is it's full of not only how to use this special pectin, but it's full of different recipes that will help you walk through using this different pectin. And also, how that previous book, the Bell book, had tons of recipes for Canning, this one also does that too, but it talks about those recipes in using less sugar. And that's a goal I have for here on the Homestead. So the next book out in the all preserving books section would be the Ball Complete Book of Home Preserving. Now, that's what it is. It's a complete book. It reflects 15 years of new recipes and changes that have happened over the 15 years in the Ball Company. There's different recipes. There's a large section on low sugar and fermentation. See, this book does more than just canning. But it is still, even though it holds everything, it's still very good for first timers because there's handy tips that will help you first learn how to do that. It says there's 400 innovative recipes for salsa, savory sauces, pickles, chutneys, relishes, and of course jams, jellies, and fruit spreads. So this is another book that will just expand more on canning, but also into that fermenting and other areas. The next one in this section is called Can It and Ferment It. More than 75 satisfying small batch canning and fermented recipes for the whole year. What I liked about this book is that it goes with the seasons, because this is the idea of that, things come into our grocery stores, even if we don't grow them ourselves, they come in with the seasons. So let me explain. Strawberries, you can still get them in December, but December is not the natural season for strawberries. So those strawberries have probably been shipped for longer times from Mexico or from other places where it's still okay to grow strawberries. So the peak of strawberries are, for us in America, is June and July, because that's when the local farmers are growing strawberries. That's when they're harvesting them, are in June and July. So that's when you're going to find loads and loads of strawberries at the grocery store. So this is going to help you go through the whole year and talk about both canning and fermenting. But it's also going to do that small batches. Small batches are great for new beginner growers, new beginner homesteaders, and even for me in certain areas. Even though I've been at this process of growing my own food for 17 years, there's still things like fermenting that I'm not used to. It even includes things about the children. So I don't own this book. This is something that I want to get to. But it has a section on spring, on summer, on fall and winter. So ideas for preserving during the seasons. And I think that is very important. The next in this section is the new homemade kitchen. 250 recipes and ideas for reinventing the art of preserving, canning, fermenting, dehydrating, and more. This book is by Joseph Schuldiner. I hope I am saying his name right. It's Schuldiner. This is a book that I don't have, but I have been thinking about getting just because of its detail. It talks about the homemade kitchen. It talks about more different ideas for preserving than just the simple canning. As you can see in the title, it talks about fermenting, dehydrating, and more. It has historical tidbits, 100 plus photos and instructions, how-tos, sidebars featuring experts, and I think this would really be like that homestead kitchen book. It really talks about bringing everything back to, cooking from scratch, everything being homemade, but it's also on the preserving side. And there's ideas and methods for like stocking a kitchen and 250 different recipes. Each chapter includes instructions to make your own pantry staples like ground mustard, sourdough starter, and so many more things. I think this book is just, like I said in the section, is a book that overcompasses lots and lots of different ideas. And I think this one goes a little bit beyond preserving, but to preserving everything in your kitchen, to making your own mustard, to making your own seasonings and how to preserve that. I think it really goes very deep into that really homestead style. So now it is time for the Growing with God segment of this episode, where we talk about growing, building that relationship with our Lord and Savior. This week's verse is John 8:36. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. I think this verse, in a way, accompanies all the things we've been talking about over this season about freedom. But I want to bring in another level here. The word son, S-O-N, is capitalized. This means Jesus. Jesus himself sets you free. Now, Jesus did several things for us to set us free. First, he came down from heaven, right? He died on the cross for us. He rose again, and he went back to heaven. He went back to heaven to do what? To become our advocate. Yes, to become our advocate. That means that he speaks for us. When we do something down here on earth that is against, it's sinful or is a sin, it's not God. Like in the Old Testament, God was the one who judged everyone. Now it is Jesus who steps in as our lawyer and says, I don't know what he says, but he steps in and advocates for us. That's why when you believe in Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior and you become a Christian and it cannot be taken away from you, that's why. Because he is there to advocate you. Your works aren't going to make you see you in a better light. Your sins aren't going to make him see you in a lesser light. He is there to advocate for you to make sure that you get the gift. You get the reward. And it's by believing in him. That's all you have to do is to get him to be your advocate. I thought when I first learned this, in my growing journey of growing with God, I connected two things. Number one, when God convicted those of the Old Testament, it was from two separate places. The people of the Old Testament were from the world, and God was separate from that. He is separate from that. And sometimes he's very straightforward. This is what I say, this is what I mean. And Jesus is the same way. But Jesus has something else that helps us in a way. He's been here. He's been to earth. He's experienced all of the tribulations that we've gone through. He was beaten. He was cursed at. He was slapped. He was put on the cross. He died. He was born. He lived as a young child. He grew up to be an adult. He missioned. He did all the things that Jesus asked us to do. He did them himself. And now he is in heaven as an advocate for us. He understands the trials and tribulations that we go through, and he still overcame them. He didn't sin while he was here on earth, but he understands what it feels like. He understands what it feels like to be looked down upon as a child. He understands what it's like to see us suffer. He suffered himself. He understands that. He's connected to us. And not only is he connected to us and understands that, he's on our side. He is there between us and God when we go to heaven. And even right now, he's sitting there advocating to God. I don't know what he would be saying about the sins I have committed, because everyone is a sinner. I mean, we can have thoughts that just pop into our heads and we don't even think about thinking about them. You know what I'm trying to say? It's just the fact that we're broken and there's nothing we can do to gain salvation. And God saw that. And that's why he sent Jesus. And that's why he sent him to endure the things that we endure every single day, so that God and Jesus, because they're together, can understand a little bit more from our viewpoint. They can understand our trials, our tribulations. They can understand our sadness. I mean, there's a verse in the Bible that says Jesus wept. He cried. He felt sad when his best friend Lazarus died. He knows what that feels like. And now he's an advocate. The Son is who sets us free. The Son is who we believe in, and that's all there is to it. You believe in him, you bring him into your heart. Because John 3:16 says, "For the God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life." That's how simple it is to be set free in Jesus' name. So if you want him to be your advocate, if you want him to set you free, it's very simple. All you have to do is say these words: I believe in Jesus Christ. I believe that he came to earth, died for my sins, resurrected as my advocate, right? As my Savior into heaven. I believe and I take into my heart Jesus Christ. Amen. That's it. That's all you need to do to be set free. So just remember this verse this week. So if the Son sets you free, you are free indeed. John 8:36. So let's get into our next section of books. we're going to be talking about meat books. So books that are focused on preserving meat. And I know we've talked about it, the jerky book in dehydration, but I think there are some more books that can be used and utilized to preserve our meats. Because another part of preserving is also learning how to cut things up. I mean, it's nice to be able to go and say, hi, I want a brisket. And the butcher gives you a brisket. Well, some of these books also teach you how to find the brisket when you are doing the butchering, or when you go shopping, you know what the brisket looks like or where the brisket comes from. Because knowing about where a part of an animal comes from helps you understand how to freeze it and can it and preserve it, and even how to cook it and use it for yourself. Something that is high moving, something that takes a lot of movement of an animal, like when they're walking, say their arms and their legs and things that are moved constantly all day long. Those are things that are going to have really strong muscle cartilage. They're going to have things that are going to hold that muscle really close together. Any cut that you get from those areas are going to be best slow cooked, so that you can slowly release those muscles and make them tender and make that meat and more flavorful and more tender by doing the slow cooking. Now, things that didn't get much movement in this is like your tenderloins, right? Your rib steaks, your T-bone steaks, all of those are along the very back of the animal. I'm talking about a cow here. They're usually on the very back, even with a goat or sheep, the loin that they're talking about. Those don't move as often. They move, but they're not under that constant movement. So those can be fried. They can be put in a pan and flipped over and fried and seared on the outside. They can also be slow cooked. Those are more versatile. Those same ideas are going to come into ways that you are going to be able to preserve that type of meat. So a great book, the very first book that I'm going to share with you, is A Guide to Canning, Freezing, Curing, and Smoking Meat, Fish, and Game by Wilbur F. Eastman. Now, this book is a very old book. It is a book that actually has been reprinted so that we can make it available for us now. It says it's a no-nonsense reference book that covers all the major meat preserving techniques and how to best implement them. You'll learn how to make corned beef, pickled tri-tip, smoked sausage, cure a turkey, and much more. All without, I think this is the important part, all without harsh chemicals. These are going to teach you how to preserve meats in the old-fashioned ways. It says this book was first published in 1975. It was republished in 1989 and again in 2002. It's very straightforward. It's got basic information. Canning, freezing, curing and jerky and sausage making, smokehouse and smokers. That's why I want to get this book, because I love smoked stuff and smoked meats are just so good. And it's something that George and I really want to learn more about. And then it breaks it apart into the different types of meat, like your beef and your veal. Then you have pork, lamb, poultry, game, fish. The next book is The Complete Guide to Preserving Meat and Fish and Game, step-by-step instruction by freezing, canning, curing, and smoking. For more than 8,000 years, humans have preserved meat through these processes. This book is wrote by Ken Osler, and this is a very detailed instruction book. It's a basics book. It's really going to take you back to the basics. It's going to go through all the steps of learning the basics of each of these processes and then talk about the preserving of meats. It even talks about case studies. So the last book in this section is called The Ultimate Guide to Smoking Meat, Fish, and Game, How to Make Everything from Delicious Meals to Tasty Treats. And I know you know why I chose this book. It's because it's about smoking. Yes. And I think it goes into great detail. This is something that is going to be put on my wish list. It's on my wish list. It's going to be put on my purchase list for this year because it goes into great detail about, beef, pork, salmon, venison, buffalo, and so many other things. It talks about all the steps that you need to follow. It's broke up into 2 parts or 3 parts. You have smoking in general, and then you have jerky, and then you have sausage. And so it really dives into just focusing on smoking. One thing that my husband and I would really love to learn more about is like the different temperatures and why different types of wood, like apple wood, goes better with this type of meat, and cherry wood goes better with this type of meat. And I think this book really dives into those areas, as well as includes lots and lots of recipes so that we can learn to do this stuff for ourselves. I think preserving meat, or even growing animals in general, takes a lot of time and effort. A cow needs to mature for 18 months. That is a lot of time before it can go to harvest. A chicken is 8 to 12 weeks. That's still more than a tomato. That's still more. Well, pumpkin would probably be the same amount of time, but it's still a long time, and a lot more effort goes into growing our animals. And so I think preserving your meat needs to be, if that's a step you're going to do, you need to take it seriously. You've worked really hard to grow this animal, and you're also, I'm going to say it, you're taking a life, and so it should be respected, and it should be looked on as a gift. It's a gift from that animal to you. And so taking the time to learn about properly preserving that animal is so important. And I know freezing, we had an episode all about preserving meats before this, and I know freezing is a very easy way to go. But if you really want to learn more about preserving your meats, these 3 books would be great. Just take your time, because you've taken your time in growing that animal. Take your time in learning how to preserve it. So now it's time for the extra section of these books. So these are extra books that I own, a couple of them, and they're just books that kind of helped me on my homesteading journey, but also led to more ideas besides just canning or dehydrating, instead of just a process. There's other ways to store fruits and vegetables. There's other ways to preserve things than just the simple ways. So these books go a little bit more detailed into those ideas. So the first one is called Root Cellaring, Natural Cold Storage of Fruits and Vegetables. So this book goes into great detail about developing a root cellar, and not only showing you details of how to develop that root cellar, but it talks about how to preserve in that root cellar. It talks to you about what guidelines you need to make sure are available for those different vegetables in your root cellar so that they will properly store. It goes through things like planning your root cellar and keeping closets and fruit hideaways, and like if you're going to make a basement root cellar, it talks about doing that. That's what I'm going to do. It talks about an excavated root cellar. That's like this, like the old time root cellars where it's its own building and it's dug into the ground. So this book really goes into not only the ideas of how to build your own, but also how to utilize it, how to make that root cellar so you can store your vegetables properly. This book is the Root Cellar book, was wrote by Mike Bobel and Nancy Bobel. So the next book is Preserving Food Without Freezing or Canning, Traditional Techniques Using Salt, Oil, Sugar, Alcohol, Vinegar, Drying, Cold Storage, and Lactic Fermentation. So this book is a book that goes over a lot of different ways that I haven't really shared with you. They're more like deeper educational ways. I don't think they're harder. I just think they need a little bit more learning. And what's wrong with what's wrong with reading a book about it? Elliot Coleman, this is a gardener that I have learned so much about. He recommends this book. He actually has a foreword in the first section of this book. Food preservation techniques can be divided into 2 categories: science, where you remove the life from the food, and natural methods, where you enhance or maintain the life of the food. So this book really dives into those ideas that will help you maintain and improve the life of the food, instead of just about, taking away the nutrients. Because even high temperature drying will take away nutrients. So this book really dives into those deep things, and it is the last book. This is a book that I own. I also own the Root Cellar book, but The Backyard Homestead by Carleen Madigan. I bought this book 6-7 years ago. So I have this book and the different version of this book. So the other version is the Backyard Homestead Guide to Raising Farm Animals. And so I when I bought that book, I bought this book too, because I just felt like they needed to be together. So this book is based on really taking apart your homestead and talking about everything, every part of your homestead that needs to be preserved. It, talks about preserving your harvest. It also talks about ideas of how to grow a homestead on 1/10 of an acre. And so this book really showed me how I can really, utilize my whole yard, not just my garden as preserving food, but bringing my whole yard into that idea, and that I didn't need to have a lot of area, that it was okay that I only had 1/10 of an acre to grow things. I could still grow rabbits. I could still grow chickens. I could still, have bees on my property at 1/10. At 1/4 of an acre, that's how big my garden just is. I could, have chickens. I could have pigs. I could have the rabbits and the bees all in that area. And then even if I went to 1/2 an acre, which I truly could utilize, that's what I utilize right now, is just 1/2 acre, mostly for our intense growing food. I do occasionally put the goats out into the 4-acre area, but those 4 acres are based on and saved for the larger animals like our horses and cows. Now cows this year. So I utilize only about 1 acre in total, but the most of the growing, because that includes like our parking lot where we put our cars, but most of our growing is done on 1/2 acre. So this book really talks about you don't need much land to have a homestead, but it goes even further. It's like, okay, now we've shown you that you can do this, that you can put this garden or this homestead on a small area. It even talks about, rotating your crops, which is just amazing. And I learned a little bit of that from Elliot Coleman, but this book really broke it down for me. It even has like a list of what should follow what, and just makes a natural succession of it. And it gives you pictures and guides of, like how you can plant your vegetables really close together to get all the vegetables you can. Even tips on a little bit of container gardening and cool and warm season vegetable gardening, extending the season gardening. It's really a book that really overcompensates the whole backyard. It goes even further into like backyard fruits and nuts. But it's just a great book. Maybe it's not focused just on preserving, but it's a great book, as well as the additional book that I bought with this, the guide wrote by Gail Damerow. It goes into more detail, of how, like, especially with like collecting the milk and things, it talks about making your own cheese. But what these 2 books did for me is, how you have all those dreams in your head? This book made it impossible. It like put the picture there, and it was like, I could do this. It was after this book that we decided to really expand and add the dairy goats, but add the meat chickens and add the different layers to our homestead and not just the garden. This is the book that really helped me expand on that idea and show me that I didn't need to use all of the 6 acres. I could easily raise my homestead and raise the animals I wanted to raise on 1 acre. And it showed me how to do it. And it's just a really great book. And I just couldn't help putting it in episode about books. I just couldn't help doing that. So to recap, I just want to remind you that educating yourself is the first step to a homesteader. Even if you don't have the land, even if you're not ready to start canning, right now you can spend that time educating yourself. And there's really some really good books out there, and they're not very expensive. All of these books are under $20. All of them. You can buy them for under $20. It'll be really hard for me to put all these books in the description, so I'm going to put them in the show notes. So it will be links in the show notes to Amazon, but I am not affiliated. I don't have an affiliated link, so I will not be getting any money from you purchasing. But if you do, the reason I'm sharing is to help you gain knowledge. That's all the reward and the thanks I need, is you gaining that knowledge, putting some of that knowledge on your bookshelves. These are books that I want, things that I have on my shelves and I've learned from, and I wanted to share them with you. So there's dehydrating books, fermenting books, canning books, preserving, all types of books, meat books, and even some extra books. And I even put in one of my favorite homesteading books. It wasn't much about preserving, but it's my favorite. So I want to thank you for joining me today, and I appreciate you. I appreciate you listening and joining me. And if this is your first time to the Pray Just Plant podcast, I want to welcome you. I want to welcome you to the Red Ridge Farm Homestead family. And if you have any questions or anything that I can help you with, any free resources that you want, or even ask me a question, you can go to my website, www.redridgefarm.org. And as always, don't let the world hold you back. Pray, just plant.